Hello everyone and bonjour à tous. That's French, a very common language that's spoken through many places out the world, such as Belgium, Canada, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, just to name a few. And it brings up the question, when you have a language so lively as French or English, that can a language actually die? Yes, in fact, a language can die, and the reason, more often than not, for a language to fall out of the popular use is due to cultural integration with other communities, neighboring countries, conquering countries, as well as, personal persecution of a certain type of people. Oftentimes, and we'll use this as an example later, with the Hebrew language and the Jewish community. Barry Moses is actually featured on an episode of TED Talks where he discusses his experience growing up with the Spokane tribe. He tells a story about how when he was young in the longhouse with his family, his friends, his neighbors, how the elders, the dozens of elders that were around the room were all speaking to each other in the Spokane language, but anytime they would go to address the younger people, primarily the children, they would always address them in English. This is actually what will kill a language. It creates a rift in between society whenever you have one group of people, in this case the elders of the tribe, speaking the Spokane language, and you have the younger generation who is up and coming and learning these habits of spoken language, at the time English primarily. It creates this rift where, and as Barry Moses described it, it made him feel that the Spokane language was something for the older generation, and that it did not include him or the younger people in the group. Latin is a very common language to be viewed as a dead language, but in fact, Latin actually never died. It was split into two categories. You had the Latin that was used primarily in the churches and in politics in Rome, and then you had the more common Vulgar Latin, as it was called, and this was typically the more used social Latin that was used from person to person discussing everyday life. Now the thing about it is Latin never died with this. In fact, it was actually absorbed into other languages, other Romance languages close to Italy at the time, stuff like French, other Italian languages, English, German. You had all of these coming in together. They were all coming to contact whenever you would have the wars that would go about, and you would have the trading. All of these would come together and actually create a new language. And that is why Latin is most commonly viewed as dead, because it's not primarily spoken anymore, but instead it's fused and created something new. Which brings up an interesting question, is, can a language ever die then? And in fact, yes, it can. To better prove this point, we are going to look back at English, a most common language for all of us. And when you stop and think, how far back, with language changing as it always does, how far back can you actually go speaking English and still understand what is being said? Now the answer is actually only about 500 years. You have the language we speak today. Now, even if it's broken up, chances are you can understand what someone is saying if they're speaking in an English accent to you. In fact, when you stop and you look at English and you realize all the cultural infusion that it has had in the past, you start to realize that it changes a lot. And we'll get more on that later when we talk about slang. But for now, we will focus on the fact that when it comes to speaking English, you can only really go back about 500 years and still fully understand what's being said. As generations grow up, they come in contact with different people, and the languages will naturally change over time. So what we're speaking now would not make any sense to someone speaking English 500 years ago, and possibly 500 years in the future, what we're speaking now will make no sense to them. When it comes to slang and understanding how exactly slang affects a language, it shows a good evolution throughout a small amount of time. Whenever you have stuff like groovy, as an old example of a slang that was commonly used that has fallen out of favor, to moving to something like rad, where that was popular for a long time, and then you have something now which is more commonly used, such as a word like selfie. You realize that in these small amount of times, a language can change a lot. Something that can be said in the 70s wouldn't make total sense to someone growing up in the early 2000s or even now in 2016. Everything has its own spot, and as you continue to age in a language, it doesn't always fit perfectly together. Moving to issues about reviving a language, we can look down at the Hebrew language and really see where things fall into place when it became something of an uncommon tongue to now when it's still more widely known and used, especially amongst the religious groups. Around the 2nd century, Hebrew was actually being replaced by different languages to something more common, something more regional, and less specific to a certain group, in this case, the Jewish community. Around 1881, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda actually decided to use Hebrew more in his common language with his friends to actually speak more and keep the language alive indirectly. This has actually led to a revival of the Hebrew language, something that had previously fallen out of favor. And it brings up the question, how many people does exactly it take to bring a language from near extinction, as in the Hebrew case? Well, not many, surprisingly. It actually just takes a movement of dedication by a certain number of people to try to bring something new to the table. In this case, with the Hebrew language, Eliezer and his friends were constantly speaking in the language and bringing forth other people wanting to know, primarily the youth. If you don't bring the youth into a situation when it comes to speaking new languages, they will often just revert to whatever they grew up with. In order to get a language fully revived, it's more often than not that it's needed for a youth group to push forward and speak the language itself due to the time constraints given to an older generation. Not to sound morbid. Older generations simply have less time to influence those after them. But if you integrate the young mind, one where it's still absorbing much of the information, and you push them into these new languages in order to communicate more and spread what they know to generations that come after them, it continues an influx that continues to grow and makes a language stay viable for longer periods of time. A lot of times too, when it comes to reviving a language, a simple youth movement isn't enough to actually move things forward. Oftentimes, a government interference can bring things forward too. If you look back in the 40s with the Navajo Code Talkers, Navajo was actually in a steep decline where most people were not actually using it. But whenever a government issue came out to where they could use this language for a form of basically impenetrable code, it became something more. It became something that actually had meaning again. This often will bring forth something that is much needed to help revitalize a language if the youth cannot bring it forward any longer. Such things now are being used very often when it comes to preserving Native American languages in terms of keeping the youth involved, keeping government records of how the language is actually spoken in an attempt to actually keep things together and where it does not have to die necessarily. The Navajo Code Talkers was actually something very good for the Navajo language. It gave the bump and the inspiration to the youth that they needed in order to want to relearn the language and pass it on to something further as more than just something that was the past, but instead it's something that was pushing their heritage forward. Unfortunately, more often than not, finding a group of people that want to learn a language that is completely dead, not just relearn a language or something with their heritage, but in fact learn something that is no longer used at all, is more hopes and dreams than anything else. It's very hard, it's very difficult, and oftentimes it cannot get the movement behind it that it needs. So when it comes to preserving a language, it's something true, it's something to work for, as opposed to trying to bring something back from the dead, well, it's something just for zombie movies.